The paper tore before my daughter finished saying, "Please." Kimberly ripped Evie's speech contest application straight down the middle, then tore it again until my 11-year-old's name lay in pieces across my parents' dining room floor. "You were born this way," my sister said. "Trying to change it is pointless. You'll never speak like Lucas." My mother did not stop her. She folded her hands beside my father's untouched coffee and said, "Your sister is right, Sarah. Stop filling that child with false hope." Evie did not cry. Not yet. She knelt beneath the table, gathered every torn piece, and pressed them against her chest. Her fingers were shaking, but when she looked up, she forced the words through one painful pause at a time. "Then I'll prove all of you wrong." I thought the worst thing my family had done was destroy her chance to compete. 3 days later, the cousin they had spent years calling perfect stood beneath the school lights, opened his mouth, and could not say a single unscripted word. And when Kimberly silently mouthed, "Start over," I realized she was not surprised. She was terrified. Before I tell you how we reached that stage, stay with Evie and me until the end. Tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel if you believe every child deserves the time to finish their own sentence. A few hours before that dinner, I was finishing my Friday mail route beneath a thin October rain. Wet leaves clung to the curb, and my postal jacket had begun to soak through when my phone buzzed. Mom had sent one message. "We moved Evie's practice earlier. Kimberly thought she needed more time. Dinner is still at 6. No one had asked whether I could leave work early." By the time I read it, the practice was nearly over. Evie had spent weeks preparing for the speech contest at her middle school. Every evening, she sat at our kitchen table with a pencil, a glass of water, and her tablet propped against a cereal box. She had titled her speech, "Before You Finish My Sentence." Lucas had trophies. His medals hung in rows on my parents' living room wall. Mom recorded every debate and polished speech he gave. Whenever Evie visited, she looked at that wall a little longer than she meant to. The previous night, while packing her application, she had asked, "If I make the finals, do you think Grandma will record me too?" "Of course she will. She'll probably put it next to Lucas's videos and—" "And what?" Evie asked. I had finished the thought for her without noticing. "Mom, I was going to say it." "I'm sorry. Go ahead." She waited until the words settled. Maybe she'll finally have something of mine she wants to keep. The memory followed me to my parents' house. Kimberly's SUV was already in the driveway. When I entered, Evie sat at the dining table with her hands pressed between her knees. Her cheeks were blotchy, and her tablet lay dark beside her. "You finished already?" I asked. Kimberly answered first. She reached her limit. My sister stood at the counter cutting roast chicken, calm and polished. "What does that mean?" She couldn't get through the first page without falling apart. We slowed it down, we started over. Lucas demonstrated pace and breathing, but she got more upset. I looked at Evie. "Is that what happened?" Kimberly kept talking. "She is not ready." Across the table, Lucas avoided my eyes. His right hand rested beneath the table, but I saw his thumb touch each fingertip in order. It was the same rhythm Evie used when a word would not come. Kimberly glanced at him. Lucas closed his hand. Mom carried in the green beans and smiled too brightly. "Let's eat before everything gets cold." That was how my family handled discomfort. Put food on the table, change the subject, and pretend silence meant peace. Dinner began with Lucas. Mom asked about his summer speech workshop. Dad wanted to know where his newest medal would fit. Kimberly repeated what his coach had said, that Lucas was born for a stage. Evie moved potatoes around her plate. Dad finally looked at her. "Are you sure you want to put yourself through this contest?" "I want to." "You do not have to prove anything," Mom interrupted. "Some children are comfortable in front of people. Others have different strengths." "What strengths do you think I have?" Evie asked. Mom blinked as if the question were disrespectful. Kimberly set down her fork. "Sarah keeps teaching her that wanting something badly enough makes it realistic." Her teacher encouraged her to enter, I said. Teachers encourage everyone. That does not mean everyone belongs in a competition. Evie took the application from her folder and slid it toward me. I only need your signature. I reached for my pen. Kimberly snatched the paper. Give it back, I said. This contest is not a place for an experiment. Evie pushed back her chair. Please, I practiced for weeks. The paper tore before she finished the word. No one moved. One half hung from Kimberly's hand. Evie's photograph split beside her name. Then Kimberly tore it again. You were born this way, she said. Trying to change it is pointless. You'll never speak like Lucas. Mom folded her hands. Your sister is right, Sarah. Stop filling that child with false hope. Dad leaned back. There is a difference between supporting a child and setting her up to be humiliated. You are turning hope into cruelty. Their words reached me, but my body stayed still. I had been trained for that silence. Kimberly spoke. Mom decided what was respectable, and Dad called surrender reasonable. For a few seconds, I was a child again, waiting for permission to object. Then Evie slid from her chair. I stood, but she was already beneath the table gathering the pieces. One had fallen near Lucas's shoe. He picked it up and held it toward her without meeting his mother's eyes. Evie took it and pressed the pieces against her chest. Then I'll prove all of you wrong, Kimberly sighed. You are feeding the drama, Sarah. No, you created it. I took Evie's coat. Mom followed us into the hallway. Do not turn one disagreement into a family crisis. Evie can stay tonight like usual. Evie often stayed with my parents when my Saturday route began early. I had depended on that arrangement for years. She is coming home with me. Then you are making this bigger than it needs to be. It was already big to her. Rain streaked the windshield as we pulled away. Evie held the torn pieces in both hands. She did not cry until I started the engine, and even then, she wiped her face quickly. Do you think Grandma ever wanted to clap for me? The question hurt more than Kimberly's words. I don't know what Grandma wanted, I said. But you deserved better tonight, and I'm going to find a way to submit your application. Even torn? Even torn. I sounded more certain than I felt. At home, Evie placed every piece inside a clear storage bag, smoothed it flat, and set it beside her folder. While she changed into pajamas, I carried her tablet to the kitchen. The speech practice app was still open. A small recording icon remained at the top, but I was too angry and exhausted to investigate. I closed the cover without pressing anything. Then, I opened the school contest portal. I expected an empty account or a missed deadline. Instead, Evie's name appeared beside an audio file uploaded Thursday night. Beneath it was a yellow status bar. Audio received. Parent authorization pending. Kimberly had destroyed the paper. She had not destroyed Evie's chance. The yellow status bar stayed on my screen long after midnight. Audio received. Parent authorization pending. I printed a new authorization form, then placed Kimberly's torn version beside it on the kitchen table. The new sheet looked clean and official. The old one looked like evidence of something none of us were ready to name. By Saturday morning, Evie had helped me match the pieces. I used clear tape across the back, so her photograph and name sat together again. You don't have to fix that one, she said. I know. Then why are you doing it? I smoothed a crease near her signature line. Because what she did still happened. Evie pulled her sleeves over her hands. She had barely touched breakfast, and when I offered to play the audition file, she shook her head. My voice sounds bad on recordings. It doesn't sound bad. It sounds... I almost said different. Then I saw her waiting for me to finish another sentence about her. What does it sound like to you? I asked. She stared at the taped paper. Like a door that keeps getting stuck when somebody is trying to come through. The answer hurt because I understood exactly what she meant. Every pause made her feel as if the rest of the world had already reached the other side and was deciding whether to hold the door. Before leaving for my Saturday route, I emailed Elena Parker, the teacher listed as the contest coordinator. I explained that Evie's paper authorization had been destroyed by a relative after the audio submission was uploaded. I did not describe the dinner or repeat Kimberly's words. I attached the clean form, asked whether I could bring the original signature Monday morning, and left for work with my phone in the front pocket of my jacket. The station was loud with rolling carts and scanners. I checked my phone twice before loading my truck and once more during my first break. Elena answered shortly after 11. Evie's audio had been received before the deadline. I could bring the signed authorization to school before the preliminary round on Monday. Elena also wrote that parent volunteers could assist with practice, but they could not accept or reject a student's application. Kimberly had no authority to remove Evie. For the first time since dinner, I let myself breathe. It felt almost simple. I would sign the paper, take Evie to school, and let her teacher decide whether the audition earned a place. My family could disapprove, but they could not erase the file already sitting in the school system. I called Evie during lunch. She was home reading on the couch. Elena says we can bring the form Monday. There was a pause. That means you still have a choice, I added. Nothing happens unless you want it to. Do I have to listen to the recording? No. Do I have to decide now? No. Her breathing softened. Okay. The small victory lasted until late afternoon. I was sorting packages at my final stop when Kimberly sent me a video. There was no greeting, only a sentence beneath the attachment. Watch this, before you hurt her again. The clip was 43 seconds long. Evie sat at my parents' dining table with her speech in both hands. Her face was wet, and the first page shook hard enough to blur the words. Kimberly stood somewhere behind the phone. Go on, my sister said. Evie opened her mouth. Nothing came. Lucas sat across from her, looking down at his own pages. Use the pace Lucas showed you, Kimberly said. Evie tried again. Her shoulders rose, but the word would not come. Mom's voice entered from the side. Sweetheart, no one is forcing you. Evie pressed both palms against the table. I can't do this. The clip ended. I watched it 3 times in the parked mail truck. On the first viewing, I saw my child crying. On the second, I noticed the way Lucas sat perfectly still while she struggled. On the third, I heard something at the very beginning, half buried beneath the sound of the chair scraping. Kimberly's voice said. Again. The clip had not started when the practice began. It had started after something had already happened. Still, the final words belonged to Evie. I could not pretend Kimberly had invented them. My daughter had said she could not do it, and I had not been there to hear her. By the time I got home, Mom had called twice. She answered my return call in a voice so gentle it made me more uneasy than anger would have. Sarah, I know you think we were cruel. You stood there while Kimberly tore her application. She should not have torn it. But you did not see the hour before dinner. What happened during that hour? Evie asked to stop more than once. She was exhausted. Kimberly tried everything. Why was Lucas there? To show her what steady pacing sounds like. Mom sighed. You were at work. I am not blaming you for that. But you cannot decide what she can handle when you are not in the room. After the call, I sat in the kitchen with my uniform still damp at the cuffs. For years, I had promised myself Evie would not grow up measuring her worth against our family's comfort. Yet, I had also wanted this contest so badly for her. I wanted her on that stage. I wanted my parents to watch. I wanted one undeniable moment that would force them to see what I saw. The thought frightened me. Was I helping my daughter claim something she wanted? Or was I asking her to repair the part of my childhood that had never learned how to fight back? Evie entered quietly and saw the paused video on my phone. You watched it. Yes, I did say that. I know. She sat across from me. I kept my questions small because I did not want to hand her the answers I hoped to hear. What happened before Kimberly started recording? Evie looked toward the window. Aunt Kimberly made me start over when I got stuck. How many times? I don't know. A lot. Did you ask for a break? She nodded. Grandma said I would never finish if I stopped every time it got hard. What did Grandpa do? He kept looking at his watch. And Lucas? Aunt Kimberly made him read my first paragraph so I could hear how it was supposed to sound. Did he say anything to you? He told me where to breathe. Her mouth tightened. Was he mean? I don't know. He did what she told him. That answer left Lucas in a place I did not understand. He had helped demonstrate the very comparison Kimberly used to humiliate Evie, but I remembered the way he had hidden his hand beneath the table. Evie's tablet lit up beside her. A message from Lucas appeared. Sorry. Before she could open it, the message disappeared. He deleted it. She said, What do you think he is sorry for? I don't know. She stared at the empty screen, then said, Maybe I should quit. Because of the video? Because if I go Monday, Aunt Kimberly will be mad at him too. She already thinks he helped me. I wanted to tell her not to quit. The words rose immediately, urgent and certain. I stopped them before they reached my mouth. This is your choice, I said. Not mine, not Kimberly's, not Grandma's. What if I make the wrong one? Then we deal with it together. But it still has to be yours. Evie thought for a long time. I'll go to school Monday and talk to Miss Parker. I'm not promising I'll speak. That's enough. By Sunday night, she had fallen asleep beside me on the couch, with her head against my shoulder. I reached for her tablet to lower the volume and saw the speech practice app still open. A recording from Friday afternoon filled the screen. 58 minutes. My thumb hovered above the file. The 43-second clip had already made me question my judgment. 58 minutes might confirm everything Kimberly said, or prove something worse. Evie shifted in her sleep and curled closer. I locked the screen without pressing play. A new email arrived from Elena, with Monday's preliminary schedule attached. I opened it and found Evie's name near the middle. Lucas Holloway was listed directly before her. When Evie woke, she studied the order for several seconds. I don't want to beat him, Mom, she said. I just don't want them to use him to erase me. On Monday morning, I carried 2 versions of Evie's application into the school auditorium. One was the clean form I had printed and signed. The other was the original. She had taped together, piece by piece, its scars visible beneath the plastic sleeve. Evie walked beside me with her speech folder pressed against her chest. She had decided to speak with Miss Parker, but she still had not promised she would stand on the stage. Kimberly was already there when we arrived. She stood beside the registration table, wearing a navy blazer, and the calm expression she used whenever she wanted strangers to believe she was the most reasonable person in the room. Lucas sat 3 chairs away, silently moving his lips through the opening lines of his speech. When he saw Evie, his eyes dropped to the floor. Elena Parker took my signed form and checked the submission time on her laptop. The audio was uploaded before the deadline, so the application can be completed this morning, she said. I would still like to speak with both of you before Evie performs. Kimberly stepped closer. I already explained what happened Friday. Evie had an emotional breakdown during practice. Sarah was not there to see it. I received your concerns, Elena replied. I also received Sarah's request. I will speak to Evie directly. Kimberly smiled, but the muscles around her mouth tightened. Of course. I only want what is safest for her. My parents entered before I could answer. Mom hurried toward Lucas with her phone already in her hand, while Dad placed a folded program across the seat beside him. They had chosen the front row, but neither of them looked around for Evie. When Mom finally noticed us, she gave a small nod and turned back to Lucas. Because Elena was still reviewing Evie's paperwork, she asked us to wait beside the aisle near the front of the auditorium. We stood only a few feet behind Kimberly, with a clear view of her face and the stage. Evie noticed the empty space at the other end of my parents' row, but she did not ask whether we could sit there. Lucas was called before her. He walked to the lectern, adjusted the microphone, and waited for the room to settle. The nervous boy who deleted messages before sending them seemed to disappear as soon as he began his prepared speech. Every word arrived at the correct pace. His pauses were placed exactly where an instructor would expect them, and his eyes lifted from his cards at carefully practiced moments. Mom held her phone high and recorded the entire performance. Dad leaned forward with both hands on his knees. Kimberly watched without blinking, silently shaping a few words along with Lucas, as though she had memorized the speech too. When he finished, the judges thanked him. One of them, a gray-haired woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain, asked him to remain at the microphone for an unscripted question. Lucas looked toward Kimberly. The judge smiled. "What would you change about the way your family listens to one another?" The room became very still. Lucas opened his mouth. His lower lip moved, but the first word did not come. He tried again, pushing air against the same sound until his shoulders tightened. Mom slowly lowered her phone. Dad looked toward the families seated behind him, checking whether they had noticed. Kimberly did not look confused. She leaned forward in her seat, turned her face toward the stage, and silently mouthed 2 words. "Start over." From where I stood, I saw them clearly. Lucas swallowed, returned his hands to the sides of the lectern, and tried again. The sound caught harder this time. His fingers curled around the wood, and the practiced confidence drained from his face. He looked at Kimberly once more, but she repeated the same silent command. Beside me, Evie lifted one hand. She touched her thumb to her index finger, then the next, moving slowly through the rhythm she used when a word refused to come. She did not call Lucas's name. She did not step into the aisle. She simply kept tapping, where he could see her. Lucas's eyes shifted from his mother to Evie. He copied the movement beneath the edge of the lectern. Thumb to index finger, thumb to middle finger. His breathing slowed enough for the first word to pass. "I wish people would wait," he said, pausing before the next phrase. Before deciding what someone was going to say, the judge nodded. "Thank you, Lucas." A few people applauded, gently rather than triumphantly. Lucas stepped away from the microphone and walked off stage without looking at his mother. Mom lowered her phone completely. Dad stared at his program, while Kimberly rose so quickly that her chair struck the row behind her. Evie turned to me. There was no satisfaction in her face. "Is he okay?" "I don't know." Kimberly reached the side door before Lucas did and pulled it open. Evie took one step after them, then hesitated. "I just want to tell him he did good," she said. We followed as far as the backstage hallway. Lucas stood near a stack of folded chairs, while Kimberly spoke to him in a low, controlled voice. He saw Evie approaching and moved away from his mother. "You helped," he said. "You finished it," Evie replied. Lucas glanced toward Kimberly. "Mom says no one can know this happens to me." The words were barely audible, but I heard them. Kimberly heard them too. Shit. Our way and took Lucas by the upper arm. "That is enough." "I wasn't telling anyone," Evie said. "You distracted him on purpose." Evie stepped back as if Kimberly had pushed her. "I was helping him. You were supposed to be waiting for your own evaluation. Instead, you inserted yourself into his." "That is not what happened," I said. Kimberly turned on me. She knew exactly what that gesture would do. The accusation told me more than she intended. Kimberly recognized the finger rhythm. She knew Lucas would recognize it too. Elena appeared in the doorway before the argument could grow. She looked from Lucas to Kimberly, then at Evie. "I need everyone to return to the auditorium." Kimberly released her son's arm. "Lucas is finished. We are leaving." "I still need to discuss what happened," Elena said. "There is nothing to discuss. He had stage fright." Lucas stared at the floor. Elena did not challenge her in the hallway. Instead, she asked me and Evie to remain after the next student. When we returned to the auditorium, Mom and Dad followed Kimberly outside without speaking to us. Evie sat beside me in the aisle seat and watched another student begin. Her hands shook in her lap. I expected her to say she wanted to leave, but she stayed until Elena called us into a small practice room behind the stage. Elena closed the door and placed Evie's application on the table. "What happened with Lucas does not determine your place in this contest," she said. "Your audio submission was strong enough to continue to the preparation round. Your paperwork is now complete." Evie looked at me, then back at Elena. "Does that mean I have to speak today?" "No. Today's live reading was intended for students who had not submitted audio. You already did. It means you may continue preparing for the final program." Relief moved across Evie's face so cautiously that I was afraid to trust it. Elena added that Kimberly would no longer assist with Evie's practice because their family relationship created a clear conflict. Another teacher would work with her instead. For a few minutes, it felt as if we had won something. Kimberly had failed to destroy the application, and Evie's own recording had earned her place. No one had rescued her or handed her a favor. Her work had survived the paper being torn. Outside the practice room, Kimberly was waiting alone. "How long have you known?" I asked. She did not pretend to misunderstand. "There is nothing to know. Lucas said this happens to him. He was nervous. You told him to start over before anyone else understood what was happening." Her face changed for only a second. "You saw what you wanted to see." Mom and Dad appeared at the end of the hallway. Mom walked directly to Kimberly's side. "Lucas was tired," she said. "That is all." Dad nodded. "Do not turn one difficult moment into something it was not." The three of them answered too quickly and with the same certainty. I watched them lead Lucas toward the exit, and for the first time, the question was no longer whether they were hiding something. It was how long they had been hiding it. That evening, Elena sent me an email. I expected updated practice times or the name of Evie's new instructor. Instead, the subject line read, "Concern regarding Evie's emotional readiness." The message included the 43-second video of Evie crying. The written complaint attached beneath it had not come from Kimberly. It had been signed by my mother and father. I read my parents' complaint 3 times before I understood what they had done. They had not simply repeated Kimberly's concerns. They had written that I was using Evie to settle an old rivalry with my sister, that I was pushing a vulnerable child toward public humiliation, and that the school should intervene before I caused lasting emotional harm. The 43-second video sat beneath their signatures as if it proved every word. One sentence stopped me. Mom had written, "Kimberly has spent months making sure Lucas never has this problem in public." She had meant it as praise, but it did not sound like the description of one bad morning. It sounded like a system. I copied the sentence into a separate document and highlighted it before calling Elena. She answered between classes and spoke carefully. "The complaint does not automatically change Evie's place in the program, but I cannot ignore a concern about a student's emotional readiness. You saw what happened Monday. I saw part of it. I also have a video of Evie saying she cannot continue. That clip starts after almost an hour of practice. If you have more context, send it to me. I need to evaluate what happened to Evie, not the conflict between you and your family." Her tone was not cold. It was cautious, which somehow frightened me more. Elena had no reason to trust me over 3 other adults, especially when 2 of them were Evie's grandparents. I ended the call with a promise to send anything relevant, then found Evie standing in the hallway behind me. "Grandma thinks you're making me do this," she said. I wanted to answer before the fear settled in her face. I wanted to tell her none of it was her fault, and that I would fix everything. Instead, I pulled out a chair and waited until she sat across from me. "What did you hear?" "That you're using me to fight Aunt Kimberly." She rubbed the edge of her sleeve between 2 fingers. "What if they're right about part of it?" The question landed because I had asked myself the same thing. I told her I had wanted the contest to become proof that our family had underestimated her, but wanting that did not give me the right to make the decision for her. "If you stop," I said, "I will still stand beside you. If you continue, I will stand beside you. What they wrote about me does not get to become a decision about you." Evie stared at the dark tablet on the table. If I quit, Aunt Kimberly wins. If I stay, Grandma says you're hurting me. That is the trap they made. You do not have to choose based on what makes either side look right. After a long silence, she reached for the tablet. The 58-minute recording remained inside the practice app, untouched since Friday. I asked whether she wanted me to hear it alone, but she shook her head. They did it to me, she said. I want to know if I remember it right. I pressed play. At first, the recording contained ordinary sounds. Chairs moving, papers turning, Mom setting dishes in the kitchen. Then Kimberly asked Evie to begin. My daughter reached the second sentence before her voice caught, and almost immediately Kimberly said, "Start over, you lost the pace." Evie began again. This time Mom interrupted to tell her to speak faster. Dad asked how long the speech was supposed to take. Kimberly told Lucas to read the paragraph so Evie could hear the difference between hesitation and a controlled pause. Lucas read it smoothly. When he finished, Kimberly said, "That is what judges expect." On the recording beside me, Evie tried again. Her breathing grew louder each time she restarted. She asked for water. Mom told her breaks would only make her dread the next attempt. Dad checked his watch and muttered that dinner was getting late. At the 26-minute mark, Evie asked to stop. Kimberly said, "Not while you are giving up." At 34 minutes, Evie cried. No one ended the practice. At 49 minutes, Mom told her that Lucas had already completed the full speech twice and still had enough focus to help her. Near the end, Kimberly picked up her phone. The audio shifted as she moved closer. "Again," she said. Those were the first words in the clip she had sent me. The final 43 seconds played exactly as I remembered. Evie struggled, pressed her palms against the table and said, "I can't do this." This time, however, the sentence no longer sounded like a confession about her ability. It sounded like the only exit left after every request to stop had been ignored. I paused the file. Evie's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady when she said, "She waited until I broke." I closed the tablet and moved my hand across the table, stopping before I touched hers. "Do you want me to send the whole recording to Miss Parker?" Evie nodded. "Send all of it." I attached the file to an email and explained only what could be verified. Kimberly's clip began during the final minute. The complete recording showed repeated restarts, comparisons with Lucas, and several requests for a break. I did not accuse my family of a diagnosis, a conspiracy, or anything I could not prove. The sound was enough. Elena called the next afternoon. She had listened to the recording with the school counselor. Kimberly would no longer be permitted to coach Evie or communicate on her behalf. The contest staff would also disregard the edited clip when assessing Evie's readiness because it lacked the events that produced her reaction. Relief came first, followed by anger so sharp I had to sit down. What about my parents' complaint? It remains part of the correspondence, but it does not override the full recording or Evie's own wishes. I will speak with Evie directly before each program decision. For the first time, someone outside our family had refused to let the loudest adults define what Evie felt. Kimberly called 10 minutes later. "You sent a private family recording to the school." It was Evie's practice recording. She agreed. "You are turning coaching into abuse because you cannot tolerate standards." You kept going after she asked to stop. "She will face impatient people her entire life." I was preparing her. "No, you were creating the failure you wanted to film." The line went quiet. When Kimberly spoke again, her voice had lost its polished calm. "You understand Mom and Dad will not keep rearranging their lives for you after this." Every Friday, my parents picked Evie up when my route ran late. Without them, I would need a supervisor's approval for a temporary schedule change, another carrier willing to cover the final portion of my route, or a new after-school arrangement I could barely afford. Kimberly knew exactly where to press. I told her Evie would not be alone with any of them until I understood what had happened. Then I ended the call before fear could make me negotiate. At the postal station the next morning, I asked my supervisor for a short-term adjustment and explained that my childcare arrangement had changed unexpectedly. He did not promise anything. Any route coverage would require approval and another carrier's agreement, and I might lose the overtime I depended on. I thanked him anyway, and left knowing the boundary I had drawn would make our lives harder before it made them safer. That evening, Evie sat on the couch, listening to a voice message from Lucas. The message ended after 2 words, then disappeared. Another arrived, smoother, but still unfinished. It disappeared too. The 4th version was flawless. "Good luck with your speech," Lucas said. "I hope you get to stay." Evie lowered the phone. "He keeps starting over." I returned to my parents' complaint and read Mom's sentence again. "Kimberly has spent months making sure Lucas never has this problem in public." This time, I understood what it meant. Kimberly was not reacting to something that happened on Monday. She had been managing it for months. By Friday afternoon, Elena had listened to the full recording twice and scheduled a private meeting with Kimberly and me. She made it clear before we entered the conference room that the discussion was about Evie, not Lucas. Any information involving another student would remain private unless it directly affected Evie's participation. I agreed, because I did not want Lucas turned into evidence against his own mother. Kimberly agreed, because she believed privacy would protect her. She sat across from me with a folder on her lap and told Elena the recording proved exactly what she had already said. "Serious coaching is uncomfortable," she explained. Evie became emotional because Sarah has protected her from every difficult moment. I pushed her to finish what she started. "You kept pushing after she asked to stop," I said. "She would have stopped after every hard word." "I am not here to debate your training philosophy. You did not have permission to force my daughter through an hour of practice, record her breaking down, and then send only the final 43 seconds. Kimberly looked at Elena instead of answering me. "Sarah is making this personal." "It became personal when you tore up Evie's application," I said. "The school only needs to decide whether she earned a place and whether she is safe from interference." Elena opened Evie's file. Her audition had been uploaded before the deadline, the authorization was complete, and the judges had scored the recording high enough for her to continue. Nothing in the full practice file showed that Evie had chosen to withdraw. Elena confirmed that Evie would remain in the program under a different coach. Relief moved through me, but it did not last. Elena placed a copy of Evie's draft on the table and said the speech committee would still need to review the final version. The title, "Before You Finish My Sentence," and several lines about being compared with a cousin could be interpreted as identifying another child. The school had to make sure the speech described Evie's experience without exposing a student's private struggles. Kimberly leaned forward. "That is exactly what I have been trying to explain. She plans to humiliate Lucas in front of the entire school." The accusations sounded protective until I understood what she was doing. Kimberly had spent years displaying Lucas's medals, praising his perfect delivery, and using him to prove Evie was inadequate. Now that his perfection had cracked, she was hiding behind his privacy to keep Evie silent. "Evie has never asked to talk about Lucas's difficulty," I said. "She wants to talk about what people have done to her. She cannot separate the two." "That is for Elena and the committee to decide, not you." Elena said Evie could revise any identifying language without giving up the subject of her speech. Kimberly left the room, insisting she was protecting both children. I watched her walk away and realized she had not denied knowing about Lucas. She had only argued that no one else had the right to speak near the truth. That evening, Mom invited us to dinner at a family restaurant near her house. She called it a chance to calm down before things became impossible to repair. Evie did not want to go, but Lucas had sent no messages since Monday, and she was worried Kimberly was blaming him for what happened. I agreed on the condition that we would leave the moment anyone attacked her again. Mom and Dad were already seated with Kimberly and Lucas when we arrived. A small gift bag rested beside Lucas's chair. Mom pulled out a framed photograph of him holding his latest medal and asked whether he wanted it placed above the fireplace or beside his debate trophy. No one asked Evie about the next round. When the server came, Mom ordered Lucas's favorite steak without looking at the price. Evie chose soup, and Mom asked me whether I had considered reducing her speech therapy appointments. With everything costing more, you have to decide what is actually producing results, she said. Lucas stopped cutting his food. Kimberly answered for him when Dad asked about his next competition, saying he would be ready as soon as he had time to reset. Lucas kept his eyes on the table and avoided every question that could not be answered with a nod. Dad waited until the meals arrived before addressing me. You need to withdraw, Evie, and end this before both children suffer. Evie continuing does not harm Lucas. It already has. He was embarrassed in public, and now his private business is being discussed at school. Kimberly brought his name into the review because she wanted Evie's speech restricted. Mom set down her fork. You keep turning every attempt to protect this family into an accusation. Evie had been silent beside me, but her gaze remained fixed on the framed photograph near Lucas's chair. Grandma, did you ever record one of my speeches? Mom's face tightened. You never gave us anything worth recording. The words fell across the table with such casual certainty that for a moment I could not breathe. Evie looked down at her soup. I reached for her hand, but stopped before touching it, waiting for her to decide whether she wanted me close. Across from us, Lucas lifted his head. That's not true. The final word caught. His mouth tightened as he tried to continue, but Kimberly stepped in immediately. He means you have other talents, she said. Lucas shook his head and tried again. Kimberly pushed back her chair, placed one hand on his shoulder, and announced that he needed air. He did not argue as she led him toward the entrance, but he looked at Evie before the door closed behind them. Evie watched the empty chair. He hates it when she does that. When she speaks for him? I asked. She nodded. He looked the same way I feel. Mom tried to restart the conversation, but I asked for the check. She reminded me she had called the dinner to repair the family. I told her repair could not begin while one child's achievements were framed, and the other child was told she had never done anything worth remembering. Evie's phone vibrated as we reached the parking lot. Lucas had sent a voice message. His first few words came quickly, then a pause entered the recording. For once, it had not been deleted. My mom makes me record things again, he said. She says I have to keep doing it until there are no pauses left. I didn't want her to say that about you. Evie listened twice, not because she had missed the words, but because Lucas had allowed the silence to remain between them. She looked at me and asked whether we should send it to Elena. Not without Lucas's permission, I said. He gets to decide who hears his voice. The next morning, I contacted Elena and asked whether the school counselor could offer Lucas a private place to speak if he chose. I did not send his message or describe it word for word. I only said he might be under pressure and needed an adult who was not part of the contest or our family conflict. Kimberly's email arrived less than an hour later. Its subject line read, "A reasonable solution." She offered to stop objecting to Evie's participation if we accepted 4 conditions. Evie had to replace her speech with a new subject. She could not mention family, a cousin, being interrupted or compared with another child. I had to tell Elena that Kimberly had never interfered with the application or pressured Evie during practice. Kimberly ended by saying the agreement would protect Lucas, spare Evie further embarrassment, and allow our parents to move forward without choosing sides. She had written it as though she were offering peace. Then, I read the final condition. No reference to the torn application. That was when I understood what she truly feared. Kimberly was no longer trying to keep Evie off the stage. She was trying to make sure my daughter reached it with nothing true left to say. I did not answer Kimberly's email that morning. I printed it, placed it beside Evie's draft, and waited until she had finished breakfast before asking her to sit with me. The offer looked almost reasonable when reduced to black ink. Evie could remain in the contest. Kimberly would stop objecting. My parents would supposedly step back. The only price was everything my daughter actually wanted to say. There are 3 choices, I told her. You can keep your speech and let the school review it. You can write about something else. Or you can leave the contest. None of those choices will make me disappointed in you. Evie read Kimberly's conditions slowly. Her finger stopped beside the line forbidding any mention of a cousin. If I keep my speech, will people know about Lucas? Not if we protect what belongs to him. You cannot name him, describe what happened on stage, or tell anyone something he trusted you with. But you are allowed to talk about being interrupted. You are allowed to talk about being compared with someone else. You are allowed to say your application was torn. What if they figure it out anyway? Then we remove anything that points to him specifically. We do not erase your life to hide what Kimberly did. Evie looked at the taped application inside its plastic sleeve. I don't want to hurt him. I know. That is why the speech has to stay about you. She chose to keep the subject, but agreed that several lines needed changing. Her first draft described sitting beside Lucas's trophies and wondering why her grandparents had never recorded her. That detail was true, yet in a school auditorium filled with people who knew both children, it could identify him too easily. Evie crossed out his name, then stared at the blank space it left. I still want to say they used another kid to make me feel small. You can, I said. You just do not have to tell the audience who that child was. The next afternoon, Elena met us in a practice room with the teacher who had been assigned to coach Evie independently. They did not tell her to soften the pain or make the family sound kinder. Instead, they asked a simple question after each paragraph. Was Evie describing her own experience, or revealing something that belonged to another student? That distinction gave the speech a shape. Evie began with a pause, and what people assumed it meant. Then she moved to the application someone believed could be destroyed before she had earned the right to try. The third section focused on the seconds people refused to wait, and the final section rejected the idea that she needed to sound like someone else. She wrote one line about words crowding behind a locked door. I leaned over her notebook and changed it to, sometimes my thoughts gather at the threshold, waiting for my voice to let them through. Evie read my version twice. That doesn't sound like me. It means the same thing. No, it sounds like something an adult says when she wants people to think she's smart. The teacher lowered her eyes to give us privacy. Heat rose into my face because Evie was right. I had taken a clear sentence she understood and polished it until her voice disappeared beneath mine. What did you want it to say? I asked. She restored her original words. Sometimes I have too many words, and they all try to get through the same door. I nodded. Keep yours. On the drive home, I apologized. Evie shrugged at first, but I did not let myself escape with a quick apology that required nothing from me. I keep telling everyone not to speak for you, I said. Then I try to make your words sound the way I think they should. You do it when you're nervous. How can you tell? You talk faster. That answer stayed with me. Kimberly forced Lucas to repeat himself until no pause remained. My version was gentler, but the impulse came from the same place. I wanted to protect Evie from judgment by making her easier for other people to hear. In doing that, I was still allowing their comfort to shape her voice. The consequences of refusing my family followed me to work the next morning. My station supervisor had reviewed my request for a temporary adjustment, but he could only approve it if another carrier accepted the final portion of my Friday route. A coworker agreed to cover one afternoon, in exchange for help with a heavier section later in the month. The supervisor approved the change, but warned me that I would lose several overtime hours if the arrangement continued. I signed the revised schedule anyway. One covered afternoon did not solve the rest of the month. I still needed a reliable after-school arrangement, and every available option cost money or time I did not have. Kimberly had expected that reality to frighten me back into obedience. It frightened me, but it did not change the answer. Mom called while I was loading trays into the truck. I almost let it ring out, then answered because I wanted to hear how she would defend the offer. You are making everyone pay for your stubbornness, she said. Your father barely sleeps. Kimberly is trying to keep Lucas stable. Evie is being dragged through meetings, and now you are changing your work schedule. Kimberly could end this by leaving Evie's speech alone. She gave you a compromise. She gave Evie permission to compete, as long as she says nothing true. Mom exhaled sharply. Not every private experience belongs on a stage. Then why did you write that Kimberly had spent months making sure Lucas never had this problem in public? The silence lasted long enough for me to hear carts rolling across the station floor behind me. Mom? You are twisting my words. I'm asking how you knew. Monday was supposed to be one moment of stage fright, but you wrote as though Kimberly had been managing it for months. We helped her. Helped Lucas? Another silence followed, heavier than the first. When Mom finally spoke, her voice had changed. We handled Kimberly too. The sentence made the loading dock seem to tilt beneath me. What does that mean? It means your sister had difficulties when she was young, and your father and I refused to let them define her. She learned discipline. She learned control. She became successful. I remembered birthday recordings from our childhood, Kimberly standing in front of the fireplace with a sheet of paper. I remembered Dad lowering the camera before she finished, then starting again from the beginning in the next clip. Until that moment, I had assumed the tapes were damaged, or that he had been impatient with the equipment. Did Kimberly stutter? You always need a label for everything now. That is not an answer. It was handled, Sarah. That is all you need to know. She ended the call before I could ask anything else. For months, I had been digitizing my parents' old tapes for their 50th anniversary. Several boxes still sat in my bedroom closet. I had watched family vacations, school plays, and Christmas mornings, but I had skipped many of the speech practice recordings because they seemed repetitive. Kimberly would stand in the same place, begin the same paragraph, and vanish when the image cut abruptly to another attempt. Now, I could not stop remembering those cuts. Kimberly sent me another message near the end of my route. She wanted an answer before 8 the next morning so she could resolve the matter with Elena. If I did not accept, she warned that anything said about Lucas would be treated as deliberate harm. At home, Evie sat at the kitchen table rewriting the opening of her speech. She had drawn a small line between two sentences and written, "Wait here. Don't apologize." "Do you think Grandma will come hear it?" she asked. "I don't know. She came to all of Lucas's." "I know." Evie looked down at the page. "Part of me still wants her to hear it and finally understand. That is not wrong. But if I write it for her, then she still gets to decide whether it matters." I opened Kimberly's message and typed the only answer that no longer felt negotiable. "You tore up her application. Now you want to tear up everything she planned to say." "No." I sent it before fear could edit me. Evie read the message over my shoulder, then returned to her draft. "If Grandma doesn't come, I'll still say it. I'll be there." "I know, but that's different." She held her pencil above the page. "I have to stop writing it for her." After Evie went to bed, I pulled the old video boxes from my closet and carried them to the machine I had been using to convert the tapes. Dust coated the plastic cases. Some labels had faded, but one near the bottom was still clear. I placed the tape into the converter and read the handwriting again. Kimberly, school speech, age 10. The tape began with static. Then the living room from my childhood came into focus. The furniture was different, but I recognized the brick fireplace, the brass clock on the mantel, and the pale carpet my mother used to vacuum in perfect lines. Kimberly stood in front of the fireplace holding a sheet of paper with both hands. She was 10 years old. Her hair was tied back with a blue ribbon. She wore the white blouse Mom saved for school events, and her knees were pressed so tightly together that the fabric of her skirt pulled across them. Dad's voice came from behind the camera. "Whenever you're ready." Kimberly took a breath and began. Her first sentence came quickly. The second slowed near the middle, and then one sound would not move. I watched her jaw tighten as she tried to push through it. Mom spoke from beside the camera. "Start over." Kimberly lowered the paper, swallowed, and returned to the first line. She reached the same word and stopped again. From the beginning, Mom said. The tape jumped slightly. Kimberly began once more. Dad's wristwatch entered the frame as he checked the time. Each new attempt started with less confidence than the last. By the fifth, her hands were shaking so hard that the paper rattled. Then I noticed her fingers. Her left thumb touched her index finger, then the middle finger, then the next. It was the same quiet rhythm Evie used, the same rhythm Lucas had copied beneath the lectern. Mom reached forward and pulled Kimberly's hand away from her skirt. "Do not do that where people can see." Kimberly tried again. The word caught. Dad lowered the camera toward the carpet, but he did not turn it off. For several seconds, the screen showed only his shoes and the edge of the coffee table. The voices continued. "I can't," Kimberly whispered. "You can," Mom replied. "You are choosing not to control it." "I'm trying. No one outside this house needs to know you talk like that." A child's voice entered from the hallway. She said it right before. I recognized myself before the camera tilted toward me. I could not have been more than 6. I stood in the doorway holding a stuffed rabbit, looking confused by the adult's anger. Dad pointed away from the room. "Sarah, go play somewhere else." "But Kim already did it." "Out." The image cut. I sat in front of the converter with both hands covering my mouth. For years, I had remembered Kimberly's childhood as a series of moods. She was private. She hated school presentations. She became angry when I interrupted. Our parents had described her as difficult, dramatic, and determined to embarrass herself. The tape showed something else. It showed a child trying until the people who claimed to help her became the reason she could no longer continue. I watched another recording from 2 years later. Relatives crowded our living room during Christmas, and an aunt asked Kimberly about a school play. Kimberly began answering, but the first word caught. Mom placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Sarah, tell Aunt Linda what Kimberly means." "On the tape," I answered proudly. I spoke quickly while Kimberly stared at the floor. The adults praised me for being helpful. I paused the recording and closed my eyes. I had been a child following instructions, but that did not erase what Kimberly must have felt. My parents had trained me to believe speaking for her was kindness. Decades later, I had carried the same habit into my own kitchen and finished Evie's sentences whenever I felt rushed or afraid someone else might judge her. I cried for the girl standing in front of the fireplace. I also cried because understanding her pain did not excuse what she had chosen to do with it. Kimberly knew exactly how it felt to be forced to begin again until a sentence no longer belonged to her. She knew what it meant when a parent hid every imperfect recording and displayed only the polished version. She knew the shame of being treated as a problem the family had to manage. Instead of ending that pattern, she had rebuilt it around Lucas. Evie threatened more than his place in a contest. She threatened the belief Kimberly had used to survive her childhood. If Evie could stand on a stage with pauses in her speech and still deserve respect, then everything our parents had done to Kimberly had not been necessary. If Lucas could be supported without being made afraid of his own voice, then Kimberly had spent years repeating cruelty while calling it preparation. That truth explained her fear. It did not excuse the torn application, the staged practice, or the edited video. Evie found me at the table after school, with the tape stacked beside the converter. I turned off the screen before she entered. Kimberly's childhood belonged to her, and I would not make Evie carry details she did not need. "Did you find something?" she asked. I found out Aunt Kimberly had trouble speaking when she was young. Evie sat across from me. "Like Lucas?" "Something similar. Grandma and Grandpa made her start over again and again. They hid it from other people." "Is that why she does it to him?" "I think it is part of the reason. But what happened to her does not give her permission to do it to you or Lucas." Evie looked at the taped application lying beside her draft. "Did you know?" "Not the way I know now. But when I was little, Grandma sometimes made me finish Kimberly's sentences. Everyone called it helping." "You do that to me." There was no accusation in her voice, which made the words harder to hear. "I know. I kept my hands still on the table. I am sorry. I do not want to ask you to forgive me, just because I finally understand it. I want a chance to do better. Evie studied my face. Then wait when it's hard, not only when we're alone. I felt the old instinct to promise quickly, to fill the silence and reassure her. Instead, I waited until I could answer without hiding behind urgency. I will. The next morning, I called Elena and told her I had found family recordings that showed a long pattern of forcing Kimberly to restart speeches and hide her difficulty. I did not email the files to the school or offer them as public proof. Elena arranged a private conversation with the counselor and explained that the tapes could help them understand the risk of coercion, but they would not determine Evie's place in the contest. Evie earned her position through her audition, she said. The school is not going to reward or punish her based on another family member's childhood. That is exactly what I want. I shared only the sections necessary to explain the phrase, "start over," and why Kimberly's response to Lucas had not been spontaneous. Elena asked me to preserve the original files and not distribute them. I agreed. I wanted the pattern stopped, not Kimberly's childhood exposed to strangers. That afternoon, Lucas sent Evie a text while we were revising her speech. "Mom wants me to tell Miss Parker you made me lose focus." Evie handed me the phone. "What do I say? Ask him what he wants." She typed slowly. Lucas answered that he did not know. He said his mother had already written down what he was supposed to tell the counselor. I took the phone only after Evie offered it. "You do not have to tell me anything if it feels unsafe," I wrote. "You can speak privately with Miss Parker or the school counselor. You are allowed to use your own words." He did not respond. Mom called 20 minutes later. She did not ask how Evie was doing. She asked whether I had gone through the anniversary tapes. "You told Kimberly," I said. "She had a right to know you were digging through her childhood. You gave me those tapes to convert, not to use against your sister. I have not sent them around. I showed the school only enough to explain the pressure being placed on two children." Mom's voice hardened. "You have always wanted to believe you were kinder than the rest of us." Before I could answer, someone knocked on my front door. Kimberly stood on the porch. She entered without waiting to be invited, her face pale with anger. Evie was in her room, and I kept my voice low. "You had no right to show those tapes," Kimberly said. I did not show them to Evie or the contest committee. Elena and the counselor saw only what was necessary. "You are using the worst moments of my childhood to win. I do not need your childhood to prove you tore Evie's application, pushed her until she broke and sent an edited clip. The tapes explain why you refused to stop." Kimberly folded her arms across her chest. "You have no idea how cruel people can be. Mom and Dad made sure I could survive outside that house. They taught you to be afraid of being heard before you were perfect. They taught me control. And now you are making yourself the first person Lucas has to fear." Her expression changed, as if I had struck her. "You think letting children fail publicly is love? I think teaching them that your approval disappears when they struggle is not love." Kimberly looked toward Evie's closed bedroom door. "You are going to lose Mom and Dad over this. You will lose the childcare, the holidays, every bit of help you have depended on. You are also going to destroy whatever relationship Lucas and Evie still have. Those costs do not give you ownership of Evie's voice. You always were naive, and you always call fear realism when you need someone else to obey it." Kimberly moved toward the door, then stopped with one hand on the knob. When she turned back, the anger in her face had settled into something colder. "Lucas will tell them Evie did this to him." She closed the door behind her. I stood in the silence she left behind, and understood that uncovering the truth had not ended her plan. It had only forced her into its final stage. Elena arranged the meeting for Thursday afternoon in a small conference room beside the school counselor's office. She reminded me before we entered that I was there only because Kimberly had accused Evie of deliberately disrupting Lucas during the preliminary round. The meeting was not about diagnosing Lucas or judging Kimberly as a mother. It was about determining whether Evie had done what Kimberly claimed, and whether Kimberly could continue working around the contest. Lucas sat between his mother and the counselor with a sheet of paper resting on his knees. Kimberly had dressed him as if he were about to give another speech. His shirt was buttoned to the collar, his hair was perfectly combed, and his hands were hidden beneath the table. Evie waited in the practice room across the hall. A narrow window in the conference room door allowed Lucas to see her sitting beside Elena's assistant, revising her note cards. She had asked to come, because the accusation involved her, but Elena had protected both children from being forced into a direct confrontation. Kimberly began before the counselor finished explaining the purpose of the meeting. Lucas experienced ordinary stage fright. Evie saw that he was vulnerable and used a gesture she knew would distract him. She wanted everyone to think there was something wrong with him. "No one said there was something wrong with him," I replied. Evie helped because she recognized that he was struggling. Kimberly turned toward Elena. "This is exactly what I mean. Sarah has already created a story around one nervous moment." Elena asked Lucas whether he wanted to explain what had happened in his own words. Kimberly placed one hand over the paper on his lap. "We prepared a statement so he would not have to relive it." The counselor spoke gently. "Lucas, you may read it if those are the words you want to use." Lucas lifted the page. His first sentence came smoothly. "During the preliminary round, I became nervous because Evie was moving her hand where I could see it. The delivery was almost perfect, but it sounded nothing like the voice message he had sent Evie." His eyes remained fixed on the page, and Kimberly silently followed every word. He began the next sentence, then stopped. Kimberly touched the bottom edge of the paper. "Go ahead." The counselor asked whether he wanted a moment. Kimberly answered for him. "He is fine. He knows what he wants to say." I felt every instinct in me rise at once. I wanted to tell Lucas that we knew the statement had been written for him. I wanted to explain the tapes, the deleted voice messages, and the way Kimberly had mouthed, "Start over," from the audience. Instead, I kept my hands folded and stayed quiet. If I spoke for Lucas, I would only repeat the pattern we were trying to stop. He looked toward the window. Evie had raised her phone where he could see it. A message filled the screen in large letters. "You don't owe anyone perfect words." Lucas lowered the prepared statement. Kimberly leaned close enough to whisper, but the room was quiet, and I heard her. "Start again." He did not lift the paper. "Lucas," she said, her voice firmer, "read the next sentence." He looked at the counselor, then at Elena. His first word caught, but no one interrupted him. "I don't want to start over again." The sentence was simple, yet it reached backward through 36 years of our family. I heard my mother's voice on the tape. I saw Kimberly standing in front of the fireplace while my father checked his watch. I saw Evie at the dining table after 58 minutes of being told to begin again. Kimberly's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. She silently shaped the first word of the prepared statement, trying to guide him back into it. Elena stopped her. "Kimberly, please let him finish." Lucas took a breath. "Mom makes me record messages again if there are pauses. She makes me start speeches over until they sound right. I didn't want to tell Miss Parker that Evie distracted me. She helped me." He did not give a long explanation. He did not accuse his mother of everything she had done. He only pushed the paper away and placed both hands on the table where everyone could see them. The counselor ended my part of the meeting soon afterward. I left without asking Lucas another question. Evie stood as soon as I entered the hallway. "Did he have to read what she wrote?" she asked. He started to. "What happened?" He decided to use his own words. Evie looked through the window, but Lucas was facing away. "Is he in trouble?" "I don't know what happens inside their home. The school can support him, but we cannot make decisions for him." Elena joined us a few minutes later. She explained that Kimberly would no longer coach contestants, review drafts, or communicate with staff on behalf of any student other than her own son. Her conflict with Evie, the edited video, and her attempt to control Lucas's statement made continued access inappropriate. Kimberly was not arrested. No one announced that she was losing custody or being banned from the school. The consequence was narrower and more believable. She lost the position she had used to influence Evie's chance to compete. For Kimberly, that loss was enough to feel like public defeat. Mom called before we reached the parking lot. Dad was on the line with her. They had already heard Kimberly's version. "You ambushed your sister with those tapes," Mom said. "You made Lucas turn against his own mother." "I did not show Lucas the tapes. You put ideas into his head." I gave the school evidence about what happened to Evie. Kimberly brought Lucas into it when she tried to make him blame her. Dad took the phone. "Kimberly is your sister. Families do not expose each other every time someone makes a mistake. This was not one mistake. It was a system, and I am done helping you keep it hidden." He reminded me that my schedule was already falling apart. My supervisor had approved only a temporary change, and the coworker covering part of my Friday route could not do it forever. Without my parents, I would lose overtime and struggle to arrange after-school care. "I know it will be hard," I said. "Evie still will not stay at your house." Mom's voice sharpened. "You cannot punish us by withholding our granddaughter. This is not punishment. It is a boundary." I told them what would have to change before any unsupervised visits could be considered. They could not compare Evie with Lucas. They could not finish her sentences, pressure her in private, or turn a family dinner into another attempt to make her withdraw. There would be no gathering where everyone said they were sorry, ate dessert, and pretended the same behavior would not happen again. Dad called me unreasonable. Mom said I was destroying the family over a school contest. "The contest exposed it," I said. "It did not create it." I ended the call before they could turn my decision into another negotiation. By Sunday evening, Evie's note cards were finished, but she could not make herself put them into her bag. She paced between the kitchen and living room, pressing her thumb against each fingertip. "I think I should quit," she said. "If I go on stage, Aunt Kimberly will say I did it to hurt Lucas. Grandma will think I'm attacking her. Everyone will watch me get stuck." I did not tell her she had to prove them wrong. That promise had carried her through the night the application was torn, but I would not use it to trap her now. "You don't owe anyone a performance," I said. She stopped pacing. "What do you want me to do?" "I want the choice to be yours." "What if I choose wrong?" "Then it will still be your choice, and I will still be beside you." Evie sat at the table and read the final paragraph again. One line said, "Maybe I deserve to be heard." She stared at it, erased the word maybe, and rewrote the entire sentence. "I decide when my voice is finished." She turned the notebook toward me. I read it and handed it back without changing a word. "I'm keeping the speech," she said. We spent the rest of the evening mounting the torn application onto a sheet of dark paper. Evie aligned each piece while I held the tape. The cracks remained visible, but her name was whole again. She slid it into a plastic sleeve and placed it inside her contest bag with her note cards. On Monday morning, she dressed before breakfast and came into the kitchen carrying the open bag. Her face had lost all its color. The note cards were still inside. The clean authorization form was there too. The taped application had disappeared. Evie stood in our kitchen holding the open contest bag, while I searched every pocket a second time. Her note cards were there, along with the clean authorization form, and the photograph we had taken after mounting the torn application on dark paper. The original was gone. Nothing else in the house appeared disturbed, but a grocery bag filled with Evie's clothes sat beside the front door, items she had left at my parents' house over the past few months. My phone vibrated while I checked the lock. Mom had sent one sentence. "You don't need that prop." She still had an old emergency key from before my divorce, and I had never asked for it back, because I believed there were boundaries even she would not cross. She had entered my home, returned Evie's belongings, and taken the application because she thought removing the paper could remove the truth attached to it. Anger pushed me toward the car keys, but Evie closed the contest bag. "We'll be late if we go after her." I told her we could call Mom, drive to her house, or report that she had entered without permission, but Evie shook her head and held up the photographs stored in the folder. She can keep the paper. She can't keep what happened. That answer told me something the award never could. 2 weeks earlier, Evie had gathered those scraps, as if her future depended on putting them back together. Now she understood that Kimberly's cruelty did not live inside the paper. The application had become evidence and a symbol, but it was not the source of her voice. I printed the photograph on heavy paper, placed it inside a clear sleeve, and drove her to school. The auditorium was already filling when we arrived. Parents spoke quietly beneath the stage lights while students reviewed cards in the aisles. Diane and Robert sat near the center, dressed as if they were attending an important ceremony, rather than facing the granddaughter they had tried to silence. Kimberly sat beside Lucas, several rows closer to the stage. She looked toward Evie's folder, then at my empty hands, and a small certainty entered her expression. She believed Mom had solved the problem for her. Elena met Evie near the backstage entrance and checked the final copy of her speech. She had already reviewed every line with the committee. No student was named, no private information was disclosed, and nothing in the speech described what had happened to Lucas during the preliminary round. Evie had protected him without deleting herself. I took a seat on the aisle. When Evie's title appeared on the screen, Kimberly stood before Elena could introduce her. "This speech targets another child," she said. Several conversations stopped, and Lucas shrank lower in his seat. "The school knows there is a private family issue involved." Elena remained beside the microphone. "The speech has been reviewed. It does not identify, diagnose, or disclose private information about any student." Kimberly turned toward me. "You promised to keep this family out of it. You put this family into it when you tore up her application." I did not argue further. Elena called Evie's name, and my daughter walked onto the stage. She wore a simple blue dress and flat shoes. The printed photograph of the torn application rested beneath her note cards. When she reached the lectern, she adjusted the microphone, looked across the room and said nothing. 1 second passed, then another. A few people shifted in their seats. I saw the familiar worry rise in their faces, the assumption that she had already failed to begin. My own body tightened with the old instinct to help, but I kept my hands still and waited. Evie looked up. That pause was mine. Nobody took it away from me. The room settled. People think that when I stop talking, I have run out of words. I haven't. Sometimes I have too many words, and they all try to get through the same door. Her voice caught on the next sentence. She touched her thumb to her first fingertip, breathed, and continued without apologizing. When I was younger, people finished my sentences because they thought they were helping. A server would ask what I wanted, and before I could say it, the person beside me would answer. Sometimes my grandfather looked at his watch. Sometimes someone said, "Never mind," like what I wanted to say had stopped mattering because it took too long. Robert lowered his eyes. Diane's hands tightened around her program. Evie lifted the photograph and placed it against the front of the lectern. Someone tore up my application for this contest. She thought that if the paper was gone, I would understand I did not belong here. She said I was born this way, and trying to change was pointless. Kimberly sat completely still. The strange thing is, she was right about one part. I was born with this voice, but I was never trying to trade it for somebody else's. I was trying to learn that it still belonged to me. Evie looked down at her cards, then away from them. People can save 5 seconds by saying my words for me. 5 seconds is not a long time, unless everyone keeps telling you that you are not worth it. A woman behind me inhaled sharply. Somewhere near the front, a chair creaked, but no one interrupted. My cousin was praised because his words came quickly. I was pitied because mine came slowly. For a long time, I thought that meant he had a real voice, and I had a problem. I do not believe that anymore. Lucas stared at her. Kimberly reached toward his arm, but he moved it closer to his body. I did not come here to prove I can speak like my cousin. I came here to prove I do not have to. Evie paused again. This time, no one shifted. Some people said they were protecting me from embarrassment, but they were protecting themselves from having to wait. It was easier to call me unrealistic than to admit they had already decided what I could become. I felt tears reach my face, but I did not wipe them away. Evie had once wanted this speech to make her grandmother clap. Now she was not looking at Diane. She was looking at the students, parents, and teachers who had chosen to remain silent until she finished. "My pause is not where my voice ends," she said. "It is where you decide whether you are willing to hear the rest." She stopped. The silence lasted longer than any pause she had taken before. For one frightening moment, I wondered whether the room believed the speech was over. Then I understood. They were waiting because she had taught them to wait. Evie took one more breath. "Tonight, you did." Lucas stood first. His applause sounded alone for only a second. Kimberly caught his sleeve and tried to pull him down, but he freed his arm and kept clapping. Elena rose beside the stage. A teacher followed, then several students. The sound spread across the auditorium until parents and children were standing in every row. Diane remained seated longer than the others. When she finally stood, her hands came together slowly. Evie saw her, but she did not hold the stage waiting for that approval. She smiled at Lucas, collected her cards, and walked away from the lectern while the applause continued. Robert did not stand. He sat with his head lowered, unable to defend his silence without becoming part of every sentence Evie had just spoken. Kimberly's face had gone pale. She could not accuse Evie of lying without admitting the speech described her. Backstage, I wrapped my arms around Evie only after she stepped toward me. Her heart was pounding, and her words still came with pauses when she whispered, "I finished it." "You did." Kimberly approached before we reached the hallway. She rehearsed that for sympathy. Lucas had followed her. He looked at his mother and said, "She rehearsed for a speech contest. You're the one who made it a secret." Kimberly opened her mouth, but Lucas walked away before she could give him another sentence. The judges awarded first place to an 8th grade student who had spoken about caring for his grandfather. Evie received the Audience Choice Award and an invitation to represent the school at a district storytelling program. She accepted without pretending the applause had cured anything. When she thanked Elena, one word caught and remained there for several seconds. Elena waited. So did everyone else. After the auditorium emptied, Evie and I stood near the darkened stage, and the workers folded chairs while my parents disappeared through a side exit without speaking to us. Evie watched the doors close, then turned to me. "Did Grandma clap?" "Yes," I said. Evie nodded and slipped the award into her bag. I didn't need her to. We had nearly reached the school entrance when Mom called Evie's name from behind us. Her face was wet, and for a moment, she looked less like the woman who had signed the complaint and more like an old woman who had just realized the granddaughter she dismissed had learned to live without her approval. She opened her arms as she approached, but I stepped between them and looked at Evie first. "Do you want a hug?" Evie held the strap of her contest bag with both hands. "Not yet." Mom stopped. Pain crossed her face, followed quickly by the expectation that I would correct Evie for being rude. I did not. After several uncomfortable seconds, Mom lowered her arms. "I understand," she said, though her expression showed that she did not. "I am sorry everything became so ugly. We all made mistakes." The words sounded gentle, but they floated above the truth without touching it. I asked her what she was apologizing for. Mom glanced toward the families still leaving the auditorium and lowered her voice. "For not handling things better. That is not specific enough. Sarah, this is not the place." This is the place where Evie finally got to finish speaking. I will not let another vague apology close the subject. Mom's eyes moved to Evie, but my daughter did not rescue her. I named the actions one by one. Mom had treated Lucas's achievements as proof of his worth while calling Evie's therapy a waste. She had given Evie's draft to Kimberly signed an email claiming I was using my child, supported the destruction of her application, and entered my home to take the repaired copy. Mom admitted she should not have used the old key. She said the email had been written out of concern and insisted she had never meant to favor one grandchild over the other. Even after hearing the speech, she could not say the word favoritism without defending herself. Dad joined us near the doors. Your mother was trying to keep the family together by asking Evie to disappear whenever her presence made Kimberly uncomfortable. I wanted peace. Peace that requires a child to stay silent is not peace. He looked away toward the parking lot. That was what Dad had always done when the truth demanded more than a nod. He had spent years calling his silence neutrality, but silence had protected the people doing the harm and abandoned the child expected to endure it. I told them Evie would no longer be picked up from school by either of them. She would not visit without me, and there would be no private practice sessions, family meetings, or conversations about the contest. They could not compare her with Lucas or finish her sentences. Any relationship they rebuilt would depend on months of different behavior, not one emotional evening. Mom began to cry again. You are taking our granddaughter away. No. I am ending the access you used to pressure her. Evie reached for my hand, and we left before guilt could become another family vote. Kimberly waited near her car with Lucas. She did not apologize or look at me. When she called for him to get in, Lucas remained beside Evie for a few seconds longer than she liked. You did good, he told her. So did you. Kimberly said his name again. This time he walked to the car, but she could no longer pull him away, as if his silence belonged to her. He chose when to leave, and before closing the door, he gave Evie the same slow fingertip rhythm she had shown him under the school lights. The next evening, Evie received a voice message from him. There was only one version. He paused twice, restarted one word, but not the entire sentence, and left several seconds of breathing in the recording. I want to write my own speech next time, he said, even if it does not sound like the ones Mom writes. Evie listened without replaying it. That was good, she replied. His answer arrived a minute later. It was mine. Our lives did not become easier because an auditorium had applauded. My station supervisor approved a temporary adjustment after another carrier agreed to cover the end of my Friday route. I lost some overtime, and in return, I helped with a heavier section later in the month. A parent from Evie's class offered to include her in an after-school carpool twice a month, while one of my coworkers became an emergency contact for the days when traffic delayed my return. None of those arrangements felt as convenient as leaving Evie with my parents. They required planning, favors, and money I would have preferred to save. Still, inconvenience no longer seemed like a reason to place my daughter where love came with conditions. A week after the contest, Elena called to say Evie had been selected for the district storytelling program. The choice was based on the strength of her writing and the audience response, not sympathy or family conflict. Evie thanked her, paused on the word district, and finished it without apologizing. She kept the audience choice certificate on the small shelf above her desk, beside the first handwritten draft of Before You Finish My Sentence. She did not ask to hang it at my parents' house. Their wall had stopped being the place where her achievements became real. I finished converting the old tapes but did not send the painful sections to relatives or use them to expose Kimberly. I placed the originals in a labeled box and added a note for myself. The past explains a choice. It does not erase responsibility for it. Then I wrote Kimberly a letter. I told her I loved the 10-year-old girl who had been forced to begin again until she could no longer trust her own voice. I also told her I would not allow the woman she had become to do the same thing to Evie. The door to a future relationship was not permanently closed, but it would only open when she stopped teaching Lucas to hide and accepted that support was not the same as control. She did not answer. For once, I did not chase her silence or rewrite my words to make them easier for her to accept. Several weeks later, Evie and I stopped at a crowded food counter after one of her district practices. The lunch rush had ended, but the employee behind the register was still moving quickly, glancing toward the next customer while asking what Evie wanted. "I'd like the grilled che." The word caught. My response rose automatically. I knew her order, and it would have taken less than a second to finish it. I opened my mouth, then remembered the kitchen table, the old tapes, and the promise Evie had asked me to keep when speaking became difficult outside the safety of our home. I closed my mouth. Evie looked at me. I smiled and waited. The employee waited too. He did not sigh, offer choices, or turn toward me. Evie pressed her thumb to each fingertip beneath the counter. "Grilled chicken sandwich," she finished. "No tomatoes, please." The employee entered the order and asked what she wanted to drink. Nothing dramatic happened. No one applauded. No one told Evie she was brave. The line moved forward as if the time she needed had always belonged to her. While we waited for our food, she nudged my arm. "How long was that?" 3 seconds. "Was that too long?" "Not even close." She smiled and looked toward the pickup counter. There was no stage that afternoon, no award, and no room full of strangers standing for my daughter. There were only 3 ordinary seconds in an ordinary place, and the realization that for most of her life, I had thought helping meant taking them away. This time, I gave them back.